Today, Defund the BBC is joined by the former Brexit Party MEP and the former chairman of Southampton FC, Rupert Lowe. Thanks for joining us, Rupert.
Hi, James. How are you?
Very good. So, the BBC, were you ever a fan? If so, where has it all gone wrong?
Well, I think looking at it from a historical perspective, one can see the logic of setting up the BBC as almost an independent, fair-minded news service for the British people. I think that has some logic, but it no longer, I think, has the legitimacy. It's now become a sort of monopoly, and I liken it really to a sort of stinging nettle in your vegetable garden. It needs to be pulled out by the roots, and we need to basically return it now to the private sector, where it has to become representative of what people want by becoming part of the market. And I think we saw the disjoint with Brexit. We've seen the disjoint with all sorts of, if you like, differences of opinion between the broad base of voters and the metropolitan elite, which holds a totally different view. And I think this is going to become a very big issue going forward, because you cannot have a democracy where the will of the people is basically frustrated by a state-funded monopoly. And as we all know, if you don't pay your TV license, it's one of the few debts that you can actually end up in prison for not paying. So you become a criminal. And it's quite extraordinary that in a democracy, that is the current situation. So I'm absolutely convinced, and from my experiences of the BBC, both in sport and indeed recently with the Brexit Party, obviously with the referendum party to some extent, I did some stuff. I think they no longer are fit for purpose, and actually the health of our country badly needs the BBC to be defunded and made to justify their existence in the private sector.
I do agree. So last year we saw a huge surge of support for the Brexit Party at the EU parliamentary elections. Do you think there's an overlap of the public anger we saw at that time with the anger at the BBC we're hearing today from our supporters and followers?
I do, yes. I think the two are very much interlinked, and as I say, I don't think the BBC respects. It's supposed to be impartial. I think we all know it's no longer impartial. It is partial in many ways, but it certainly should be reflective of a fair balance of British society, and whether that's the metropolitan elite, whether it's, if you like, industrial Yorkshire, whether it's the West Midlands, where I stood as an MEP. I don't think the BBC is any longer representative of those various factions within the UK. And, you know, in football, I travelled widely across the UK. There are many different parts of Britain. Obviously, they've got different heritages, they've got different histories. I've always found that most of the people are very decent people. And very often, I think we get an unrepresentative view from the BBC on many issues now, which become almost a crusade for them. You know, I think they have just badly lost their way. The whole structure is wrong, and it needs to be radically overhauled and changed.
Do you think the people at the top of the BBC who set the agenda even see this anger? Like, do they recognize it's there, or do you think they just don't care?
Well, I think what you see with the BBC, and I've sort of felt this for some time, is they've become arrogant in that they believe and they know that they're often going to be in existence, and those people who are interviewing politicians are going to effectively outlive the term of the politician's life that they're interviewing. So you've got, if you like, a disjoint in that you've got this arrogant monopoly which is interviewing the elected body which is running the country, and the arrogance they display, I think, comes from this knowledge that they're funded by this monopolistic TV license fee, regardless of everything else. If you take local radio stations, and we had a radio station at Southampton, the BBC is able to fund these local radio stations, which do have incredible amounts of power, within the local community, but they're funded by a monopoly. So actually, for other radio stations to justify themselves against this monopoly, it's very difficult. It's difficult enough to make money in radio anyway. So I think there's an arrogance at the heart of the BBC, which often has its head in the clouds, so it doesn't really appreciate the anger, I think, that's building up within society. But the problem is most of the politicians are frightened to upset the BBC because, as we know, the oxygen of an elected politician is to be seen on television a lot. And the power that the head honchos of the BBC have is that if you challenge them too much, they don't invite you onto their shows and they marginalize you as much as they possibly can.
Yeah,
so yes, I think they're out of touch.
Yeah, it's like a complete kind of like, I don't want to say mafia-like, but it's like, we were speaking to obviously Douglas Carswell, they were behaving like gangsters. That was the notion.
Well, I think they do, and for me, they've become a thoroughly bad institution. Whether it's you look at what happened with Jimmy Savile, you look at what happened with a lot of this celebrity sort of that happened in the 80s, 90s. There was no questioning often of what was right or what was wrong. You've got the situation with Cliff Richard, which I thought was absolutely disgraceful, and indeed I think there was a case in which that was clearly made to be the case. I think their reporting on that was disgraceful. I think really they have lost their way and they need to be shaken up. I think the way in which they structured their companies, people were encouraged to structure companies to avoid paying tax. I mean, these are all things that is quite extraordinary. And nothing wrong with structuring a company, but for a BBC to be encouraging people to do it, and then a lot of them potentially left to hang out and dry when the revenue HMRC came and sort of unilaterally, which they do. And HMRC, by the way, is another organisation that needs radical change and overhaul, which is it's attacking and unfairly penalising Middle England. And missing a lot of sort of tax which they should collect from other sources. But they go for the easy targets, has always been the case. So I think HMRC is as bad, but in this case, they went after the BBC workforce who set up these service companies. It's quite extraordinary, really.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that for a long time you've been critical about the state of journalism in this country. Do you think there is a solution?
Well, I wasn't critical. I mean, I went into football believing that it was a sport, but in fact, it's more than a sport. I rapidly discovered that it's more of a religion in current Britain, modern Britain. But I had all sorts of problems with the media. I genuinely, we tried to do a good job for Southampton. I think, we built the youth academy up. I know it's a sport that has a questionable ethics in many places, and it's probably dominated by the big clubs who don't like to see little clubs getting too big for their boots, which arguably Southampton started to do with its youth academy and getting to the cup final and finishing securely in the league each time. And there is definitely some influence of the big clubs with the journalists. It's easy media to write stories about big transfers and big clubs and appeal to that, whereas in fact you need a healthy league where there's competition. That's really what makes football great. But in my case, I went into it, I fought 2 libel trials against newspapers, both of which I won, and I ended up with settlements from both. I had my phones hacked, so my mobile phone was being hacked by various newspapers. They were listening to my voicemails every day, twice a day. They were effectively able to write stories on the back of that. Again, I've had settlements, but it's been a big fight because I think they adopt the view that unless you are very tenacious and you're quite strong, you will just not bother. And in my case, I'm afraid I did bother. It's taken it takes a big toll. So I think a lot of journalists are, they need to look at themselves and they need to work out whether they could do their jobs better, whether they shouldn't be fairer, whether they shouldn't be more judgmental of themselves, whether, all the sort of things you need in a fair society, and the things that indeed they should be challenging. It's difficult if they get too close to big companies, big football clubs. They become conflicted, and in my experience, I think that is quite common, and I think some of them get too big for their boots.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the footy, because that takes me to my next question, really. So obviously you were on the board of the FA, chairman of Southampton. Is it fair to say you should have to pay for the TV license, even if the game is the only live TV you watch through a subscription, like to Amazon Prime or to Sky? Because the BBC isn't even involved, and yet you'd be committing a criminal offence.
Well, of course it's not fair. And in today's world where, I've got 4 children, most of them don't watch television. They get all their news from different sources, we have high-speed internet at home. We don't actually need the BBC, but if you have a television, you're forced to pay for it. It's just wrong. And it's out of some misguided view that the BBC does great things with documentaries, and they do great things on radio and the World Service and all this sort of stuff. Well, fine, if they do great things, then go and stand on your own 2 feet. And if people really want it, they will pay for it on a subscription. But why should they be forced to pay for it, as you quite rightly say, because they've got a television and they may never watch the BBC? They're still forced to pay for it. And you are still, as we said, you acquire a criminal record if you don't. So it's just, the whole thing is wrong. If you believe in a sort of entrepreneurial capitalist society where effectively people are able to pursue their own lives, young people don't need the BBC now at all. If they want it, they should have the option of paying for it via subscription. And if that way, we will really see whether or not these assertions that the BBC make about how much they're needed, whether they're true or not.
I mean, of course, you talk about subscriptions. So, I mean, what do you think the BBC should be doing then?
Well, I think the BBC, as I said earlier, if there is a justification for any form of state broadcaster, I think it is somebody who reports in a totally unbiased way on the news for the British electorate. So you actually end up with the electorate being properly informed. You don't get the spin that we've been having. Take Brexit. There's no question that the BBC was partisan. I mean, I went to BBC studios where, I'd go and do interviews, and people would come and see me, and they'd quietly say, "Well done, I totally agree with what you're doing, but I wouldn't dare say it here because I'd be one of, in a minority of 50 to 1, and I'd probably lose my job." So again, is that a society we want to live in? Is that a culture that the BBC should be propagating? Of course it isn't. The BBC is supposed to be completely impartial everywhere, and it isn't. That's the problem we've got. So, look. For me, it's very plain. There's a mismatch, and it's for historical reasons. It's been seen as a sort of paternal channel, and a lot of people who live overseas did value the World Service, and I think probably a lot of people who lived in other parts of Europe, particularly behind the black curtain, the Iron Curtain, they effectively got good clean news because they weren't getting it from, if you like, the East German or the Russian broadcasters. But now we've become, it's almost as if we've become, a bit like them. The BBC sort of puts its own spin on everything. So justification for it, yes, arguably a news channel which gives completely honest, straight reporting of the facts. That would be useful for society. But again, if they did that, there's no reason why that shouldn't be subscription. It doesn't have to be a compulsory state monopoly. It can be something people can decide whether they want or whether they don't want. I think, for me, a lot of the country's ills would be cured with a strike of a pen if the current political leadership had the courage and tenacity to actually do what is logical and right, and make the BBC stand on its own 2 feet. I think it would remove a lot of what I describe as a fuzzy sort of background noise that misleads people about reality, which is what the BBC has become. Most people, know it. They live their lives. They're not bothered about what Emily Maitlis thinks, or what a load of other sort of self-important people like to preach. So I think Britain's a pretty solid place, but I think people have had enough now. I think they don't want a state monopoly imposing on their lives anymore. And I think the Brexit issue was probably the defining moment which exposed the mismatch between Middle England, the decent, honest, hardworking, tax-paying people of Middle England, and this organ of the metropolitan elite, which is very much the BBC.